The summer heat of 1948 pressed down on Hartford, Connecticut like a wool blanket soaked in humidity. Inside the Cartwright family home on Elm Street, Robert Cartwright wiped sweat from his brow as he stood at the base of the attic stairs, hammer in hand. The house had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now it was his, a three-story Victorian that had witnessed nearly 70 years of family life. But the attic, that cramped space beneath the pitched roof, had remained untouched for decades. Dust-covered trunks, forgotten furniture, and layers of neglect made it more tomb than storage space. Robert's wife, Margaret, had been insisting for months that they needed to convert the attic into a proper bedroom for their growing family. Their 3 children, Thomas, age 12, Eleanor, age 9, and little William, just 5, were bursting out of the second floor. The neighborhood was thriving in the post-war boom, and families everywhere were expanding their homes, adding rooms, modernizing. The Cartwrights would do the same. What Robert didn't know, as he climbed those narrow stairs that Saturday morning in July, was that his family's history held secrets deeper than yellowed photographs and moth-eaten clothes. The attic smelled of old wood and stale air when he pushed open the door. Sunlight struggled through a single grimy window, casting long shadows across the cluttered floor. He set down his toolbox and began the work of clearing out decades of accumulation. By noon, Robert had removed most of the larger items: an ancient rocking chair with a broken runner, several boxes of his father's war memorabilia from the Great War, stacks of newspapers from the 1920s that crumbled at his touch. Margaret brought him lunch on a tray, surveying the progress with approval. Their children peered up the stairs with curiosity, but Margaret shooed them away. This was adult work, dangerous work, with exposed nails and unstable floorboards. The floorboards. Robert had noticed them immediately, how some sections felt soft beneath his feet, how others creaked with an unsettling hollowness. His father had mentioned once years ago that the attic floor might need reinforcement. Robert decided to investigate. He knelt in the center of the room where the boards felt weakest and began prying them up with a crowbar. The first board came loose easily, revealing the dark cavity between floors. Robert peered into the gap, expecting to see only joists and insulation. Instead, his eyes adjusted to the darkness and found something else: fabric, old and discolored. He removed another board, then another, creating an opening large enough to see clearly. What he discovered made his breath catch in his throat. There, in the space between floors, lay what appeared to be bedding, a thin mattress, a pillow, blankets folded with deliberate care. But these weren't storage items carelessly tossed aside. They were arranged as if someone had been living there, sleeping there, hidden from the world above and below. Robert's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone in his family hidden refugees during the war? Had a servant lived in this cramped space decades ago? But the arrangement seemed too secretive, too deliberately concealed. He reached down and pulled up the blanket. Beneath it lay personal items: a tin cup, a small wooden box, what looked like a child's doll made from scraps of cloth. Robert opened the wooden box with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in careful script on paper that had yellowed with age. He unfolded the first letter and began to read. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if written by someone whose hand trembled with emotion or fear. The date at the top read March 1889. Robert's grandfather would have been a young man then, newly married, just starting his family in this house. The letter began with words that sent ice through Robert's veins despite the summer heat. To whoever finds this, I write these words in desperation, for I fear what we have done will haunt this house forever. Robert sat back on his heels, the letter clutched in his hand. Below him, he heard his children laughing, heard Margaret humming as she worked in the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of family life continued while he held evidence of something his family had hidden for nearly 60 years. He looked back into the dark space beneath the floorboards, and for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before: scratches on the wooden joists, deep gouges as if made by fingernails. And in the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, what looked like stains on the wood. Dark stains that could only be one thing. Robert's hands shook as he reached for another letter, needing to understand what his family had done, what they had hidden in the walls of this house where his children now slept. Robert didn't come down from the attic until late afternoon. Margaret found him sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, surrounded by letters spread out in chronological order, his face pale and drawn. She climbed the stairs with concern etched across her features, drying her hands on her apron. The worry in her voice was unmistakable when she spoke his name. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged years in just a few hours. Without a word, he handed her one of the letters. Margaret sat beside him and began to read, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as the words revealed their terrible truth. The letter was written by Robert's grandfather, Thomas Cartwright Sr., and it detailed events that had taken place in the spring of 1889. Thomas Sr. had been a respected businessman in Hartford, owner of a textile mill that employed dozens of workers. Among them was a young woman named Sarah Morrison, 19 years old, an immigrant from Ireland who had arrived in America with nothing but hope and determination. She worked the looms 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, sending most of her wages back to family in County Cork. Thomas Sr.'s letter described her as hardworking and quiet, someone who kept to herself and caused no trouble. But trouble found her anyway. The letter detailed how Sarah had caught the attention of Thomas Sr.'s younger brother, Charles, a man with a reputation for drinking and gambling, a man who had never held steady work because the family's money kept him afloat. Charles had pursued Sarah despite her clear disinterest, had cornered her after work, had made promises he never intended to keep. When Sarah became pregnant, Charles denied everything. He claimed she was lying, trying to trap him for his family's money. Margaret's hand trembled as she continued reading. Thomas Sr.'s words grew more agitated, his handwriting more hurried. He described family meetings held behind closed doors, arguments that lasted into the night, his wife's tears and his mother's cold insistence that the family's reputation must be protected at all costs. Charles couldn't be connected to this scandal. The girl would have to be dealt with quietly. Robert watched his wife's face as she absorbed the horrible reality of what their family had done. The letters laid it out in painful detail, how they had offered Sarah money to leave Hartford and never speak of Charles again, how she had refused because she had nowhere to go and no family to take her in, how she had threatened to go to the newspapers and tell her story to anyone who would listen. In 1889, such a scandal could destroy a family's standing in society, could ruin business relationships built over decades. So they made her disappear. Thomas Sr.'s letter described it with a detachment that made it even more chilling. How they had invited Sarah to the house under the pretense of discussing a better settlement. How Charles had been sent away on business, so he wouldn't be implicated. How they had drugged her tea and carried her unconscious body to the attic. They had built a false floor, creating a hidden compartment where they locked her away, telling themselves it was only temporary, only until the pregnancy ended, only until they could figure out what to do. But temporary became permanent. Margaret read through letter after letter, each one documenting Thomas Sr.'s growing guilt and horror at what they had done. He wrote about bringing Sarah food and water in the dead of night, about her pleas to be released, about her deteriorating mental state as weeks turned into months. He wrote about the birth, a girl, delivered in that cramped space with only Thomas Sr.'s fumbling assistance, a child who barely survived her first days of life. The letters revealed that Sarah never left that hidden space. She died there 6 months after being imprisoned, weakened by the conditions and broken by despair. Thomas Sr. buried her body late one night in the woods beyond the property line, a grave unmarked and unmourned. But the baby had survived. The baby had lived. Margaret looked up from the letters, her eyes meeting Robert's. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked the question they were both thinking. What happened to the child? Robert handed her the last letter in the sequence, dated December 1889. In it, Thomas Sr. wrote about his wife's solution to the problem of the infant girl. They couldn't keep her, couldn't raise her as their own without questions being asked. So they had done what desperate people did in those days. They had given the child to an orphanage in New Haven, far enough away that no connection would be made to the Cartwright family. Thomas Sr. never wrote the child's name, never mentioned whether he felt relief or regret at sending her away. The final paragraph of the final letter was what haunted Robert most. "I have sealed this space and pray that no one ever discovers what we have done. Sarah Morrison deserved better than the fate we gave her. May God forgive us, for I cannot forgive myself. I write these words so that someone someday might know the truth and perhaps right the terrible wrong we have committed." Margaret set down the letter and looked at the opening in the floor, at the space where a young woman had been imprisoned and had died. The summer heat felt oppressive now, suffocating, as if the house itself was pressing down on them with the weight of its secrets. Robert and Margaret sat in silence for a long time, the letters scattered around them like accusatory witnesses. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued. Children playing, cars passing. The ordinary rhythms of a July afternoon in 1948. Inside the attic, time seemed to have stopped, suspended in the revelation of a crime committed nearly 60 years ago. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the shock. She asked Robert what they should do with this information, whether they should go to the police, whether there was any point in reporting a crime so old that everyone involved was likely dead. Robert didn't have answers. His grandfather had passed away in 1923, and Charles had died even earlier, in 1910. His life ended by the same vices that had led to Sarah Morrison's destruction. There was no one left to hold accountable, no justice to be served. But Margaret insisted they couldn't simply ignore what they had found. Sarah Morrison deserved to be acknowledged, to have her story told, to be more than a secret hidden beneath floorboards. Robert agreed, though he struggled with the shame of knowing his family's respectability had been built on such a terrible foundation. He thought about his father, who had lived his entire life in this house, who must have known nothing about what lay hidden in the attic. His father had been born in 1892, 3 years after Sarah's death, too young to have known or remembered anything about the events of 1889. They decided to continue searching the hidden space, to see if there was anything else that might provide more information about Sarah or the child she had left behind. Robert removed more floorboards, expanding the opening until they could see the full extent of the compartment. It was roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, barely tall enough for someone to sit upright, a prison that would have driven anyone to despair. In the far corner, they found more personal items, a small mirror, cracked and tarnished, a comb with several teeth missing, a rosary made of simple wooden beads. These were Sarah's possessions, the only things she had been allowed to keep during her imprisonment. Margaret held the rosary gently, imagining the young woman praying for deliverance that never came, and tears streamed down her face. But it was what they found beneath the makeshift mattress that changed everything. Wrapped carefully in oilcloth was a book, a journal with a worn leather cover and pages filled with Sarah's own handwriting. Robert opened it carefully, aware that these might be the only words Sarah herself had left behind, the only way to hear her voice across the decades of silence. The journal began months before her imprisonment, when Sarah had first arrived in Hartford. She wrote about her hopes for America, about the letters she sent home to Ireland, about her dreams of saving enough money to bring her younger siblings to join her. Her handwriting was educated, her prose thoughtful. This was not the illiterate immigrant that Victorian society would have assumed, but a woman of intelligence and aspiration. The entries documenting her relationship with Charles Cartwright were heartbreaking. Sarah had believed his promises, had trusted his declarations of love, had thought he would marry her when she discovered she was pregnant. She wrote about the moment she told him, about how his face had changed from affection to cold calculation in an instant. She described his denial, his threats, his warning that no one would believe the word of an Irish mill worker over a Cartwright. Then came the entries written during her imprisonment. Sarah's handwriting became more erratic, more desperate. She wrote about the darkness, about losing track of time, about the sounds of the family going about their normal lives just feet below her. She documented Thomas Sr.'s visits, his attempts to justify what they had done, his promises that it would end soon. She wrote about feeling the baby move inside her, about her terror of giving birth in that cramped, dark space with no proper help. The entries after the birth were the most difficult to read. Sarah named her daughter Grace, after her own mother back in Ireland. She wrote about holding the infant, about nursing her, about singing Irish lullabies in whispers so the family below wouldn't hear. She wrote about her body growing weaker, about knowing she was dying, about her desperate hope that somehow Grace would survive and have the life Sarah had been denied. The final entry was dated October 1889, just days before Sarah's death, according to Thomas Sr.'s letter. Her handwriting was barely legible, the words wandering across the page. Grace is crying. I have no more milk to give her. Thomas says he will take her somewhere safe. I made him promise to tell her about me someday, to let her know she was loved. I will never see her grow up. I will never know what kind of woman she becomes. But I pray she survives this evil place and finds happiness. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I never stopped fighting to get back to her. Margaret closed the journal and held it against her chest, sobbing openly now. Robert put his arm around her, his own eyes wet with tears. They sat together in that attic, in the space where Sarah Morrison had suffered and died, and felt the full weight of their family's crime. The next morning, Robert made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't bring Sarah Morrison back, couldn't undo the terrible things his grandfather and great-uncle had done, but he could try to find Grace. If she was still alive, she would be 59 years old now, a woman who had lived her entire life not knowing the truth about her mother or the circumstances of her birth. Robert took the train to New Haven on Monday morning, leaving Margaret to manage the children and the house. He carried Sarah's journal and the letters with him, wrapped carefully in brown paper. The New Haven Orphan Asylum still existed, though it had changed names twice since 1889 and now operated out of a different building. Robert found the administrative offices in a converted mansion on Chapel Street, where a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson managed the historical records. He explained his mission carefully, showing her the letters and the journal, telling her about the discovery in his attic. Mrs. Patterson listened with growing fascination and horror, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When Robert finished, she sat back in her chair and regarded him seriously. She told him that records from the late 1880s were incomplete at best, that many had been lost in a fire in 1903, but that she would search through what remained. It took her 3 hours. Robert waited in a small reception room, drinking coffee and watching the clock. He thought about Margaret at home, wondered what she was telling the children about where he had gone. They had agreed not to explain the full truth yet, not until they knew more, not until they understood what all of this meant for their family. Finally, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the records room carrying a thin folder. Her expression told Robert she had found something. She sat across from him and opened the folder carefully, revealing yellowed forms and handwritten logs. In December 1889, an infant girl had been brought to the orphanage by a man who gave his name as Thomas Cartwright. The baby had been approximately 3 months old, underweight and sickly, but had survived. No mother's name was recorded, which was common in cases where families wanted to avoid scandal. The girl had been given the name Grace Morrison by the orphanage staff, presumably because Cartwright had provided the surname. Mrs. Patterson explained that it was unusual for a surrendering family to provide any information at all, but perhaps Thomas Sr. had felt enough guilt to ensure his granddaughter kept some connection to her mother's identity. Grace Morrison had lived at the orphanage until age 16, when she had been hired as domestic help by a family named Richardson, who lived in Bridgeport. The orphanage had maintained minimal contact after that, as was customary, but there was one final notation in the records. In 1910, Grace Morrison had married a man named James Fletcher and moved to New York City. Robert felt his heart race. This was a real lead, a path that might lead him to Sarah's daughter. He asked Mrs. Patterson if there was any way to trace what had happened to Grace after 1910. She shook her head sympathetically, explaining that once orphans left their care and married, they essentially disappeared from the records. He would need to search New York City marriage records, census data, anything that might track Grace Morrison Fletcher through the decades. But Mrs. Patterson offered one more piece of information that proved invaluable. Among the orphanage records was a photograph taken in 1905, a group portrait of all the children then in residence. She pointed to a girl in the back row, age 16, tall and dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to look directly into the camera with quiet intensity. Grace Morrison, the caption read. Robert stared at the photograph, seeing echoes of Sarah in the girl's features, trying to imagine what kind of life she had lived. He asked if he could have a copy of the photograph, and Mrs. Patterson agreed, disappearing into another room to make an arrangement with their photographer. While he waited, Robert studied the image, memorizing every detail of Grace's face. This was Sarah's daughter, the child who had survived against all odds, who had been taken from her dying mother and raised by strangers. She deserved to know the truth. Robert returned to Hartford that evening with the photograph and the information Mrs. Patterson had provided. Margaret met him at the door, eager for news. They sat together at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Robert laid out everything he had learned. Margaret studied the photograph of Grace, tracing her finger along the girl's face, and declared that they had to find her, had to tell her what had happened to her mother. Over the following days, Robert made calls to New York City, wrote letters to various record offices, and enlisted the help of a private investigator named Daniel Morrison, no relation to Sarah, but someone who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, or, in this case, people who didn't know anyone was looking. The investigator's fee was substantial, but Robert paid it without hesitation. This was about more than satisfying curiosity. It was about giving Sarah Morrison a voice, about acknowledging her suffering, about making right what his family had made wrong. 2 weeks later, Daniel Morrison called with news. He had found Grace Morrison Fletcher. She was alive, living in Queens, New York, a widow since 1944, when her husband had died of a heart attack. She worked as a seamstress, lived alone in a modest apartment, and by all accounts was a quiet, private woman who kept to herself. The investigator provided an address and a phone number, but warned Robert that approaching her would require delicacy. This kind of news, delivered incorrectly, could cause more harm than good. Robert thanked him and hung up the phone, staring at the piece of paper with Grace's information. Margaret came to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. They both knew what had to happen next. Robert would have to go to New York, would have to knock on Grace Fletcher's door, would have to tell a 59-year-old woman the truth about her mother's death and her own miraculous survival. It was a conversation that would change Grace's entire understanding of who she was and where she came from. Robert only hoped he had the courage and the words to do it right. Robert Cartwright arrived in Queens on a humid Saturday morning in early August. The train ride from Hartford had given him hours to rehearse what he would say, but now, standing on the sidewalk outside Grace Fletcher's apartment building, every prepared word evaporated from his mind. The building was a modest 3-story structure with fading brick and iron fire escapes zigzagging down its facade. Working-class families lived here, people who earned their livings with their hands and saved their pennies for small comforts. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and found apartment 2C. For a long moment, he simply stood there, hand raised to knock, heart pounding. Inside that apartment lived a woman who had no idea that her entire life story was about to be rewritten. Robert thought of Sarah Morrison, of her journal entries describing baby Grace, of her desperate hope that her daughter would survive and find happiness. He knocked. The woman who answered the door was smaller than Robert had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that were cautious but not unfriendly. She wore a simple house dress and held a dish towel in her hands. Her face showed the lines of a life that had known hardship but not bitterness. Robert saw Sarah in her features, the same high cheekbones, the same determined set to her jaw. He introduced himself carefully, explaining only that he had information about her family history, information she deserved to know. Grace's expression shifted to confusion, then wariness. She told him that she had no family, that she had been raised in an orphanage, and knew nothing about her parents beyond their names. Robert asked if he could come inside, if she would give him just an hour to explain everything. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she stepped aside and let him enter. Grace's apartment was small but immaculately kept. Lace doilies covered the arms of worn furniture, and photographs in simple frames lined the mantelpiece. her late husband in his army uniform, what looked like friends or neighbors, a cat that had presumably since passed. She offered Robert tea, and he accepted, needing something to do with his hands while he gathered his courage. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, and Robert began to talk. He started with the discovery in his attic, the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, the letters written by his grandfather. He watched Grace's face carefully, seeing her initial skepticism give way to shock as he described what his family had done to Sarah Morrison. When he pulled out Sarah's journal and handed it across the table, Grace's hands trembled as she touched the worn leather cover. She read in silence, occasionally wiping tears from her cheeks. Robert sat quietly, giving her time to absorb her mother's words, to hear Sarah's voice speaking directly to her across 59 years of separation. When Grace finally looked up, her face was transformed by grief and wonder and anger all mixed together. She asked Robert to tell her everything, every detail he knew about Sarah, about what had happened in that attic, about how she had come to be abandoned at the orphanage. Robert told her everything. He described the letters from his grandfather, the evidence of Sarah's imprisonment, the circumstances of Grace's birth. He explained how Thomas Sr. had taken her to the orphanage, how he had at least ensured she kept her mother's surname. He showed her the photograph from 1905, and Grace stared at her younger self with tears streaming freely now, remembering that day, remembering the photographer who had come to the orphanage and told them all to smile. Grace spoke then, her voice thick with emotion. She told Robert about her childhood in the orphanage, about the loneliness and the strict discipline, about wondering every day who her parents had been and why they had given her up. She described her years working as a domestic servant, the exhausting labor and the small wages. She talked about meeting her husband James, a kind man who had worked on the docks, about their simple but happy marriage, about his death 4 years ago. Through it all, Grace had assumed her mother had been someone who couldn't keep her, perhaps a young woman in difficult circumstances who had made a hard choice. She had never imagined the truth, that her mother had fought to keep her, had loved her desperately, had died trying to protect her. The knowledge transformed everything Grace had believed about herself and her origins. Grace held Sarah's journal like it was made of glass, fragile and precious beyond measure. She asked Robert if she could keep it, if he would allow her this connection to the mother she had never known. Robert assured her that the journal belonged to her, that he had brought it specifically to give to her, along with copies of his grandfather's letters and the photograph from the orphanage. These were her inheritance, the truth of her past. They talked for hours, Robert answering every question Grace asked about his family, about the house on Elm Street, about the attic where Sarah had been imprisoned. Grace wanted to know what the space looked like, how small it was, what Sarah would have seen from that single dirty window. She asked about the Cartwright family. Were they wealthy? Were they respected in Hartford? Did anyone in the community know what they had done? Robert answered honestly, explaining his family's position in Hartford society, their textile business, their reputation for respectability that was built on such a terrible foundation. Grace's anger emerged slowly, building as she processed the full scope of what had been done to her mother. She spoke about the injustice of it, about how Charles Cartwright had destroyed Sarah's life and faced no consequences, about how the family had chosen their reputation over a young woman's freedom and dignity. She asked Robert why his grandfather hadn't gone to the police after Sarah died, why he had simply buried her body in secret and sent Grace away to strangers. Robert had no good answers. He could only acknowledge the terrible choices his grandfather had made, the cowardice and selfishness that had allowed Sarah's suffering to continue until it killed her. He told Grace that he understood if she hated his entire family, that she would be justified in that hatred. But Grace surprised him. She said she didn't hate him. Robert had been born long after these events, had known nothing about them until 2 weeks ago. He had come to find her, had brought her the truth when he could have simply destroyed the evidence and kept the secret buried. That took courage. What Grace wanted now was justice of a different kind. She wanted Sarah's story told, wanted the world to know what had happened to her mother. She asked Robert if he would be willing to help her do that, to stand with her and acknowledge publicly what his family had done. It would mean scandal for the Cartwright name, would mean shame and difficult conversations, but Robert agreed without hesitation. This was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. They made plans sitting at that kitchen table. Grace would come to Hartford, would see the house where her mother had died, would visit the woods where Sarah had been buried. They would try to locate the grave, would give Sarah a proper marker and a formal acknowledgement. They would contact newspapers, would tell reporters the full story, would ensure that Sarah Morrison's name and her suffering became part of the historical record. Before Robert left that afternoon, Grace asked him one more question. She wanted to know if anything of Sarah's physical presence remained in that attic, if there was anything beyond the journal and the few personal items. Robert told her about the scratches on the wooden joists, the marks Sarah's fingernails had left in the wood during her captivity. Grace closed her eyes and nodded slowly, imagining her mother's desperation, her fruitless attempts to claw her way to freedom. Robert took the train back to Hartford that evening, emotionally exhausted, but certain he had done the right thing. Margaret met him at the station, and he told her everything that had happened, how Grace had reacted, what they had planned. Margaret listened intently, then declared that Grace would stay with them when she came to Hartford, that their home owed her mother that much and more. The following week, Grace Fletcher arrived in Hartford carrying a small suitcase and Sarah's journal. Margaret welcomed her warmly, showing her to the guest room and treating her with a deference that acknowledged the debt the Cartwright family owed. The children were curious about their visitor, but Robert and Margaret had decided to tell them only that Grace was researching family history. The full truth would come later, when they were older and could understand the complexity of what had happened. Grace's first request was to see the attic. Robert and Margaret led her up the narrow stairs, and Grace stood in the space where Sarah had been imprisoned, where Grace herself had been born. She knelt and touched the wooden floorboards, ran her fingers over the scratches on the joists, sat in the corner where her mother had held her as an infant. She wept quietly, and Margaret knelt beside her, holding her hand in silent support. Afterward, they drove to the woods where Thomas Sr.'s letters indicated he had buried Sarah's body. The area had changed in 60 years. New roads, new houses, development that had transformed rural land into suburbs. Robert wasn't certain they could locate the exact spot, but Grace wanted to try. They walked through what remained of the old woods, searching for landmarks Thomas Sr. had described. They found the place on their third attempt, guided by Thomas Sr.'s description of a distinctive rock formation and an old oak tree that somehow still stood despite decades of development. The area was overgrown now, forgotten land between two housing developments, a small strip of woods that had escaped the builder's attention. Robert paced off distances based on his grandfather's notes, while Grace followed behind, her face pale but determined. When Robert indicated what he believed was the general area, Grace knelt on the ground and placed her hand on the earth. She spoke quietly, words meant for Sarah alone, telling her mother that she had survived, that she had lived a full life, that she had been loved by a good man. She promised Sarah that her story would be told, that her suffering would not be forgotten, that justice of a kind would finally come. Margaret had brought flowers, simple wildflowers picked from their garden that morning. Grace arranged them carefully on the spot, creating a temporary memorial until they could arrange something more permanent. Robert stood back, giving Grace privacy for her grief, feeling the weight of his family's crime more heavily than ever. This was where his grandfather had buried a young woman in secret, had covered his family's sins with dirt and silence. That evening, Robert made phone calls to the Hartford Courant and the New Haven Register, newspapers that had been publishing since before Sarah's death. He spoke with reporters, told them he had a story about a crime committed in 1889, a story that involved one of Hartford's old families, and a cover-up that had lasted nearly 60 years. The reporters were skeptical at first, but Robert's sincerity and the documentation he possessed convinced them to listen. 2 reporters came to the house the next day, John Matthews from the Courant and Elizabeth Warren from the Register. Robert, Margaret, and Grace sat with them in the living room and laid out the entire story. They showed the journalist Thomas Sr.'s letters, Sarah's journal, the orphanage records, and the photograph of young Grace. They explained how the discovery had been made, how Robert had tracked down Sarah's daughter, what they hoped to accomplish by going public. The reporters asked difficult questions. They wanted to know why Robert was willing to destroy his family's reputation, whether he expected any legal consequences, how the surviving Cartwright relatives might react. Robert answered honestly. His father's siblings were still alive, would likely be horrified and angry, but the truth mattered more than family harmony. As for legal consequences, the crimes were too old to prosecute, but moral accountability still existed. Elizabeth Warren was particularly interested in Grace's story, in how it felt to learn the truth about her mother after 59 years of not knowing. Grace spoke eloquently about the mixture of emotions: grief for what Sarah had endured, anger at the injustice, gratitude to Robert for finding her and telling her the truth. She emphasized that she didn't want revenge against the Cartwright family, but she did want acknowledgement, wanted Sarah's name cleared and her story remembered. The reporters spent hours at the house, taking notes, asking follow-up questions, occasionally pausing to absorb the magnitude of what they were hearing. John Matthews asked to see the attic, to photograph the space where Sarah had been held. Robert led him upstairs, and the reporter stood silently in the room, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck, simply taking in the reality of what had happened in this ordinary-looking space. Before they left, both reporters promised that Sarah Morrison's story would be told fully and with the respect it deserved. They would need a few days to verify facts, to contact the orphanage and confirm records, to reach out to historians who could provide context about Victorian-era scandals and the treatment of immigrant women. But they assured Robert and Grace that the story would run, likely on the front page, and that it would spark important conversations about justice and accountability. The articles appeared on Sunday morning, August 22, 1948, simultaneously in both newspapers. The Hartford Courant's headline read, "Cartwright Family Secret. Woman imprisoned and died in attic in 1889. The New Haven Register went with, "Daughter discovers mother's tragic fate 59 years later." Both papers ran photographs, the attic space, young Grace from the orphanage picture, and a current photo of Grace standing with Robert and Margaret Cartwright. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The Cartwright home phone rang constantly with calls from other newspapers, radio stations, and curious citizens. Some callers were supportive, praising Robert's courage in exposing his family's crime. Others were hostile, accusing him of disloyalty and unnecessarily damaging the Cartwright name. Robert's aunts and uncles called in fury, demanding he retract the story, threatening to disown him. Robert stood firm against the pressure from his extended family. He explained repeatedly that Sarah Morrison deserved justice, that silence had protected the guilty for too long, that the truth mattered more than reputation. Some relatives eventually came to understand his position, while others cut off contact entirely. Margaret supported him completely, telling anyone who would listen that her husband had done the right thing, the moral thing, regardless of the personal cost. Grace remained in Hartford for 2 more weeks, during which time the story spread nationally. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, often using it as a springboard for discussions about historical injustices, the treatment of immigrant women, and the power wealthy families had wielded over the lives of the poor. Radio programs invited Grace and Robert to tell their story, and they accepted several interviews, always emphasizing Sarah's humanity and the senselessness of her suffering. The Hartford community organized a memorial service for Sarah Morrison, held on September 5, 1948, in the same woods where she had been buried. More than 300 people attended, including representatives from Irish community organizations, women's groups, and local churches. A priest led the service, speaking about justice delayed and the importance of remembering those who had been silenced by power and prejudice. Grace stood at the front, holding Sarah's journal, and read aloud her mother's final entry about loving her daughter and hoping for her survival. A proper gravestone was commissioned, paid for by donations from people who had been moved by Sarah's story. It was placed in the woods at the spot where Grace had left flowers, marking Sarah Morrison's resting place for the first time. The inscription read, "Sarah Morrison, 1869 to 1889. Beloved Mother, justice delayed but not denied. Grace planted roses around the stone, and they would bloom every summer for decades to come. The story prompted calls for reform in how vulnerable women were treated, particularly immigrant women and domestic workers. Women's organizations used Sarah's case as an example of why stronger legal protections were needed, why assault accusations against wealthy men needed to be taken seriously, why families shouldn't be allowed to hide their crimes behind money and influence. Some real changes resulted. Connecticut passed new laws regarding the treatment of domestic workers, and several other states followed suit. For Grace Fletcher, the revelation transformed her final years. She left her job in New York and moved to a small house in Hartford, wanting to be near her mother's grave. She visited every week, tending the roses and talking to Sarah about her life, all the things Sarah had never gotten to see. Robert and Margaret became like family to her, including her in holidays and celebrations, giving her the family connection she had never had. Grace lived until 1967, passing away at age 78. Her obituary in the Hartford Courant noted her remarkable story and her role in bringing justice to her mother's memory. She was buried next to Sarah, their gravestones side by side, mother and daughter finally reunited. The inscription on Grace's stone read, Grace Morrison Fletcher, 1889 to 1967. Sarah's daughter. She carried her mother's story home. Robert and Margaret Cartwright never regretted their decision to expose the family secret. They raised their 3 children to understand that doing the right thing sometimes meant choosing truth over comfort, justice over reputation. The house on Elm Street remained in the family, and the attic was never converted into a bedroom. Instead, it became a small museum of sorts, preserving Sarah's journal and the letters, maintained by the Connecticut Historical Society as a reminder of one woman's suffering and one family's eventual choice to acknowledge the truth. The story of Sarah Morrison and Grace Fletcher has been told and retold over the decades, appearing in books about historical injustices, women's history, and the immigrant experience in America. Students study it in classes about social justice and moral courage. The house itself is now on the National Register of Historic Places, marked with a plaque that tells Sarah's story to anyone who passes by. In the end, what Robert Cartwright found beneath those floorboards in the summer of 1948 was more than just a family secret. It was a reminder that silence protects the guilty and denies the dead their dignity. It was proof that truth, no matter how delayed, matters. And it was evidence that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply acknowledge what happened, give voice to the voiceless, and ensure that those who suffered are not forgotten. Sarah Morrison breathed her last in that attic in 1889, but through her daughter and through one man's choice to tell the truth, her story lived on. Justice came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. And that perhaps is the most any of us can hope for, that our lives matter enough that someone will remember, will care, will refuse to let our stories die in darkness.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.